Hi, and welcome to section 5. We are going to be learning about the cell cycle in this section. You may have heard terms like mitosis and meiosis. This is exactly what we're going to be studying in this section. What this whole, what these lessons are going to entail is how do our cells divide? How do they split? The biggest thing that we need to focus on is how the nucleus of the cell, which houses all the DNA, remember? How does that distribute the genetic material equally to both cells? And we're going to distinguish between what does cell division look like in your body cells, which we call the somatic cells. We're going to write all this down. And how cell division looks a little bit different when we talk about the germline cells, the cells that you pass on to make offspring, specifically eggs and sperm cells for women and men. So we're going to distinguish between those. Towards the end of the unit, we're going to really get into the differences that are between females and males, and how cell division goes a little bit differently and how it coincides with the development in utero while you're developing inside, and also during puberty as well. So it's a good chapter, and it's going to lead us into our genetics unit and section later. So hang on, because we're going to be talking about more. We're going to be bringing everything in that we've been learning about again so far. We're going to talk about cytoskeletal filaments, specifically the microtubules. We'll be in the nucleus most of this time. The cytoplasm is there, all that good stuff. So are you ready? Here we go. Let's talk about the cell cycle. So this is section 5. The cell cycle. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of how this all happens, let's get some basic definitions down for all of this so we have all the same vocabulary moving forward. So I'm just going to call this section the introduction. And let's just call these definitions. Let me get a better black pen for you. All right. So the first thing we're going to learn about when we get into this unit is something called mitosis. So mitosis, M-I-T-O-S-I-S, mitosis. This is division of the nucleus, and usually when we're talking about mitosis, we're talking about the whole process of literally one cell splitting into two. But the specific definition for mitosis is actually the division of the nucleus into two equal parts. So the way we write this is the division of the nucleus of a somatic cell, and a somatic cell is a body cell, and it's specifically the distribution, the identical distribution of DNA from one parent somatic cell into two identical daughter somatic cells. In the cell biology language, we tend to go on the feminine side. We have daughter things, we have sister things, we have all these things you're going to see popping up later on. So it is the division of the nucleus of a somatic cell. And if you want to get specific, which I think you should, specifically, the identical distribution of DNA from a parent somatic cell and somatic, remember we talked about this here, it's a body cell. Somatic cell to two daughter somatic cells. So what that would look like, you would have your one cell with its nucleus and its DNA. It would get split into two identical cells. And they all have copies of the DNA. So we're going to talk about all that. So one cell literally becoming two. So there is a difference between your somatic cells and your germline cells, the cells that create your eggs and your sperm, because those cells are special because they're going to go create a new life one day. The cells that are in your body, everything outside of those cells, those are called your somatic cells. Those are the cells that when your mother's DNA and your father's DNA, when those two cells came together in fertilization, that is you. That is why you are literally half your mom and half your dad. So you carry half the DNA from mom and dad. And that is what makes you a somatic cell. So soma is Latin for body as well. So if you have a little bit of Latin introduction in you, you know where soma comes from. That's mitosis. And let's talk about meiosis. Erase all this. So number 2 is meiosis. It's spelled a little bit differently. Meiosis. I've heard people say meiosis as well. It works. Both ways are correct. It depends where they learned it from. I learned meiosis. So meiosis is a division of a gamete cell or a germline cell. Those are synonymous terms. So gametes and germ cells are specifically the sex cells of your body. So division of a gamete cell. And you could also think germline, egg and sperm. And meiosis is a little bit different. This is, let's compare it to mitosis really quickly. So where mitosis is, if I have a skin cell that's going to undergo mitosis, that skin cell is going to divide to become 2 identical skin cells. Great. So that's identical distribution. In meiosis, it's a little bit different. If I'm going to be creating some eggs, I don't want all of my eggs to look identical. If you have siblings, you realize you don't look like your siblings. If your parents have siblings, your aunts and your uncles don't look just like your parents. So when you go to create gamete cells, it's a non-identical distribution of DNA into, in this case, 4 gamete cells. So unlike mitosis, where you go from 1 cell to 2 cells, in meiosis, you go from 1 cell to 4 cells. We're going to talk about all the details about this, but I want you to get the definitions and the big picture first. So this is the non-identical. And this is good because if we had identical distribution for our gamete cells, we would all look the same. And that's boring. It's nice to be a little bit different. So non-identical distribution of DNA. You get a full set of DNA, it just doesn't look the same. Non-identical distribution of DNA from 1 parent gamete cell to 4 non-identical gamete cells. So from 1 gamete cell to 4 non-identical daughter gamete cells. And by the time they get to the 4 gamete cells, then you have an egg or a sperm. The parent cell isn't a mature egg or sperm yet. They have to undergo meiosis to get there. Okay, so let's do a little definition really quick on somatic, gamete, all that kind of stuff. So number 3, we kind of talked about this already. So somatic cells. Somatic cells are cells of the body cells of the body, and the cool thing about your somatic cells is that they have 2 copies of DNA. So let's just back it up for a second. If you've heard of things like 23andMe, certain companies that like to sequence your DNA and look at what kind of genes you have, are you predisposed to XYZ, whatever it is, the reason it's called 23andMe is because we have 23 chromosomes from mom and 23 chromosomes from dad. That's what makes us us. So in total, in your somatic cells, you have 46 chromosomes in every single cell. Now remember what a chromosome is. A chromosome is how your DNA gets packaged into your cell. We're going to talk about that again soon. So there's a lot of review in here. So cells of the body, every cell in your body is a cell that has 46 chromosomes in it, meaning it has 2 copies of chromosomes. So you got 1 copy from mom, 1 copy from dad. Therefore, you have 2 copies. And if you were to number chromosomes 1 to 23 from mom and 1 to 23 from dad, you would have 2 copies of number 1, 2 copies of number 2, and so on. That's what we're talking about. So cells of the body, they contain 2 copies of each chromosome. So if you were to define that, it would be 2 times 23, so you have a total of 46. And when a cell has 2 copies of chromosomes, we call that cell a diploid cell. So somatic cells are diploid, and here's what that means. That di, that prefix di means 2. Ploid is the sweet little biological term that we use for chromosome count. In this case, you have 2 counts of each chromosome. Strawberries are octoploid. They have 8 copies of chromosomes. So they get 4 from mom strawberry and 4 from dad strawberry, and there's your 8. That makes sense? So for us, we are diploid organisms. We have 1 copy from mom, 1 copy from dad, and there you go. So somatic cells are diploid, meaning they have 2 copies of each chromosomes. All right? Now let's do the other side of it. The gamete cells, which also are technically in your body, but they're different. They're reserved for a very special purpose, and the purpose is to create more humans, to create more life. And so those cells are special. So your gamete cells, these are our reproductive cells. And for ladies, it's eggs. This is the universal sign for female. And for males, that's the universal sign for male, it's sperm. Now here's the different thing. When we create gamete cells, functional gamete cells, not the parent ones are somatic because that's like the starting material, it has to come from us. But when we go to create our offspring, we have to make these functional gamete cells. By the time you get to the 4 after meiosis, these are the gamete cells we're talking about. So these gamete cells are these guys. This is like a pre-gamete cell, if you will. So for gamete cells, they're different. So we were talking about how to make a somatic cell. You get 1 copy of chromosomes, 1 copy of 23 chromosomes from mom, 1 copy of 23 chromosomes from dad. Those are in the gamete cells. So gamete cells have only 1 copy of chromosomes. They only have 23. If I were to create an egg that was going to get fertilized with 46 chromosomes, that would completely be, it wouldn't happen. And if that 46 chromosome egg got fertilized by a sperm that had 23 chromosomes, I would have way too many chromosomes present to create human life as we know it. So it just won't happen. So that's why, this is the beauty of when we do create eggs and sperm, we actually only donate half of I donate half of my DNA, my husband donates the other half of the DNA, and boom, we get a baby. And that's the beauty on how we do our reproductive cells. But for the definition here, gamete cells, so these contain 1 copy of chromosomes. So it's 1 times, that's 1, 1 times 23, so for a total of 23 chromosomes. And just like the diploid cells, when you have 2 copies, they have a special name of diploid. When you have 1 copy, we call them haploid. So gamete cells are haploid. And it's because they have 1 copy of chromosomes. Anytime you cut something in half, So if you're looking back at the strawberry, it's octoploid. In its haploid state, it would have 4. Does that make sense? Because when that strawberry goes to create a gamete cell, an egg or a sperm equivalent for strawberries, I'm not a strawberryologist, I don't know how that works, but the pollen and all that stuff. But when that strawberry goes to create an egg or a sperm, it has to cut its chromosome count in half because it's going to get fertilized by another one that has the other half. And that makes the whole octoploid strawberry eventually. So you put two 23s together, you get a somatic cell, and that is a baby. That would be us, all right? So I'm hoping that makes sense. So these words, diploid, haploid, they're gonna be coming into play a whole lot. The whole thing I want you to remember is that for somatic cells, this is mitosis. We're gonna be going from 46 to 46. So 1 cell with 46 to 2 cells with 46. For gamete cells, this is meiosis. This is messy and I apologize. Meiosis. This is when you start with 1 46 and you're going to go to 4 23s. Like, how does that happen? I will get you there, I promise. All right. One more definition, because we've been talking about the DNA and the nucleus splitting this whole entire time and not necessarily the full definition of the cell splitting. So if we were to really break it down, there's one more term we should know, and that'll be number 5, and I'm going to erase this right now. Number 5 is a nice little word called cytokinesis. So cytokinesis, C-Y-T-O, kinesis, is a term used to describe the division of the cytoplasm. So this is when the cell would actually literally split into 2. So number 5 is cytokinesis. And this is division of the cytoplasm. And often, very often, when we talk about mitosis or meiosis, it's assumed cytokinesis is happening because if it doesn't, what's the point? And it does. If your cell is undergoing mitosis, division of the nucleus, unless something really, really goes wrong, it'll continue to split into it'll split in 2. So cytokinesis, division of the cytoplasm, it's assumed it's going to happen during mitosis or meiosis. Okay, that's the definition introduction. Now, since I've been talking about DNA and all this stuff so far, let's do a little DNA and chromosome review really quickly. To get, again, it's all about the vocabulary. If you could speak the language of biology, you could understand what we're talking about here. So big B is going to be chromosomes. Let's talk about this. Chromosome, so the review on chromosomes. Let's talk about the structure of chromosomes really quickly, because this is where it comes into play. Because we're going to be doing tons of drawings on this chapter. So chromosome structure. What you got to know is that chromosomes, let's define what they are first of all. We've kind of talked about it back in Unit 1 when we were talking about our macromolecules and our nucleic acids. So chromosomes, this is the structures, the DNA, let me back it up. This is structure that DNA takes inside the nucleus. So the structure, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. The structure of folded DNA in the nucleus. All right. And a little bit more detail. Chromosomes are made of something called chromatin. So we're going to define that. So these are made of chromatin. Okay. Let's define chromatin. Number 2. Chromatin. This is when DNA, so I want you to imagine this, in every cell in your body, almost every cell in your body, your red blood cells kick out the nucleus just so they can do their job. But for the majority, vast majority of your cells in your body, you have 6 feet of DNA. If you were to put chromosome to chromosome in your body and stretch them out end to end and make a nice long chain of them, you have 6 feet of DNA in every nucleus in your cell. And here's so In order to package that much DNA, you have to provide some kind of folding mechanism for that DNA to kind of scrunch itself into a nice compact shape to fit inside a tiny little nucleus inside a big cell, big compared to the DNA. So in order to kind of wrap your DNA up and fold it all up, there's these proteins called histones, and they're very specialized proteins. And what I'm not going to go into the details of the folding mechanisms. It's fascinating. You could look it up too if you want. But what histones do is they're almost like I want you to imagine there's like these group of spheres, and they wind the DNA around them. And imagine if you're twisting a rubber band and you let it fold in on itself. That's exactly what it's allowing the DNA to do. And then it's allowing it to wrap and spiral and really get compact inside the nucleus. So what chromatin is, it's that combination of DNA and the protein that's what we call chromatin. Because your chromosomes aren't made of just pure DNA. DNA needs something to wrap around in order to fold. It's kind of like the thread around a spool. You need that spool to wrap the thread around, and that's exactly what those proteins are doing. And so if you want to compare it, the thread would be the DNA, the spool would be the protein. You put those two together, a threaded spool, that's called chromatin. Okay? You make a structure out of it, it becomes a chromosome. So chromatin is basically DNA wrapped around protein. And these specialized proteins, these are called histone proteins. And they're fascinating proteins. Big family of proteins. All right, we're almost there. And then lastly, so let me draw a picture first really quickly. So if you're looking at DNA and you have your lovely DNA, you got your double helix, and you got 6 feet of this stuff going on. And I'm gonna turn this into a string here so I could actually draw it. This string is gonna get wrapped up around proteins that are extremely small. So there's these little proteins inside here that are just allowing it to spool around itself. So the black line is your DNA. And eventually, I'm just gonna get smaller and smaller. These little things are going to keep coiling upon themselves, and then they're going to keep even getting twisted even more. And eventually, they all shape into this really cool structure that we know and love, which is your typical chromosome. And if you were, this is like the silhouette of what you would see in the picture. What's actually inside this chromosome is all this tightly wound DNA that's compacted in there. And you have 46 of these inside your cell, in your somatic cells. And they're at different shapes, or not shapes, they're all kind of shaped like that. And if you were to look, you have chromosome 1, which is really small, chromosome 22, which is really big. And then depending if you're a boy or girl, you have your XY chromosomes, and the sex chromosomes would be your 23rd chromosome. So between 1 to 22, they get bigger in size. That's how we numerate them. If I were to take all the chromosomes out of your nucleus, I could kind of plate them out in a very cool scientific method actually, and number them 1 to 23, and based upon their sizes. So 1 to 22, it gets big, and then you got your sex chromosomes out there, X or Y chromosomes, XX for girls, XY for boys, to find out if you're a boy or a girl. And inside these chromosomes, remember, they're just chock full of wrapped up DNA. And instead of drawing a squiggly line like that, we kind of draw this bowling pin arm looking thing instead. One more definition I need to give you, because this right here, so this structure, this is your chromosome. That's your chromosome. The stuff on the inside, it's the structure, is the chromosome. Chromatin is what makes the structure of the chromosome. Now, you're noticing how there's like an arm here and an arm here. there's another definition we need to give you, and that is chromatid. Don't hate me, there's all these chromas. There's chromosome, chromatid with a T-I-D at the end. The chromatid are the arms of the chromosome. So you have a little short arm and a long arm, but these arms are the chromatids of the chromosome, okay? I'm hoping that is good. I'm gonna come back on our next lesson. I'll stop right there for now. But we're gonna talk about how in the world, why am I going over chromosomes? It's because mitosis and meiosis is all about division of the nucleus. And if I'm going to split my cells in two, I better make sure that both cells have the same amount of DNA. And if it's mitosis, and if I'm replacing cells that need to get replaced, I want them to be exactly identical. And that's where we're going to focus our time pretty soon. So come on back. We'll talk a little bit more about chromosomes and get into mitosis. Thanks.